Hey you, Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activated.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend, I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Raise your hand if you've ever been prompted to leave a tip by a machine in a place that you just weren't expecting. I was prompted this summer to tip at a gas station in small town Ontario, just a normal gas station. We just stopped to get a couple Cokes. I asked some of the people who work on this show to offer me theirs, and the answers ranged from Subway, the sandwich shop, not public transit, although let's not give those guys any ideas, the shoe guy at the bowling alley, a yarn store, a cannabis shop, and on a $17 beer at a sporting arena. For the record, I declined to tip the gas station, and as I did it, I felt indignant and righteous and also guilty. But I have to draw a line somewhere. The pandemic changed tipping, or at the very least, accelerated something that had been building for years. Poll after poll show that people really don't like what's happened. But it's not slowing down, and there's no going back. Probably. However, there is one province that is firing the first shot in the war on egregious tipping practices. Time will only tell if it's a tipping point. Sorry, had to. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Corey Mintz is a food reporter and a consultant. He is also the author of The Next Supper, The End of Restaurants as We Knew Them, and What Comes After. Are we finally in the after period, Corey?
Well, let's say the post period. I think that title was haggled over during a pandemic period where we didn't know about vaccines and whatnot, and we were really putting a big ellipsis on that after. We're definitely on the post-pandemic stage where we have seen whether or not the industry was going to change, to take that opportunity to change, and we found out that the industry did not want to take that opportunity to change, not at large.
We're here to talk about tipping today, and I know we've spoken about this before in the middle of those quote-unquote unprecedented times. Before we begin, maybe I'll just ask you off the top, is it fair to say that the pandemic changed tipping forever?
I mean, it's a broad statement. It's
purposely broad.
Yeah, it's worth parsing it out. Maybe to sort of expand how did the pandemic change tipping? Because there was sort of like a real up and down arc for what happened. There was that early stage where there was this sort of like public swell about saving restaurants, those being the sort of frontline Main Street businesses we saw under threat of extinction in our communities. And part of the way people expressed that is people who could afford to eating restaurant food, ordering takeout, and tipping as much as possible. And we saw this surge where people were tipping exorbitant rates. And that really came back down to earth within a year of a return to dine-in service. But what we saw since then, there was something that was on the move pre-pandemic that's really cemented is tip creep, both in terms of how much we are prompted to tip, the range of percentages that payment terminal will suggest, as well as the different types of places that we are expected to or asked to tip. And that line in the sand has changed. And if you're asking, has it changed forever? I'd say it's the kind of change that once you make, it's pretty hard to put the horse back in the barn, the genie back in the bottle.
Here's a question for you then. Compared to what a tip has typically signified, how would you define what a tip is and what it's for today?
I define a tip as a way for a business to maintain the illusion of affordable pricing for their customers. It hides the true cost of that business's labor. Typically the way we tip 20%, 1/5 of the actual bill that we'll pay, the perception of that is offloaded, the addition of it, the payment of it to the customer. That's what a tip, I think, really always has been and what it continues to be today, whether or not people see it that way or understand it that way.
Was there ever a time in the food industry when a tip really was, I think, what most people would consider its stereotypical definition, which is like, remuneration on top of the cost for a job well done by the service staff?
It's a good question. And whenever someone says it's a good question, what they mean is, I don't really have an answer for it, but I can parse it out. There was a period after the advent of tipping, meaning the period in post-war America where the idea from European aristocracy was borrowed. What if we gave people a tip for a job well done? But specifically, what if we used that to compensate formerly enslaved people rather than actually paying them a wage? So there may have been a period when that idea became ingrained in the culture, spread throughout the hospitality industry. When I say hospitality, in that time period, I'm talking restaurants and bars and saloons, but also the railway industry, which is a big part of this. There was a period where maybe that advanced to being so everywhere to the point where it also became enshrined in laws in the States and in Canada, laws that said, if you tip people, you can pay them less. Therefore, this is by intent and definition of the law, not a gift in compensation or in generous return for someone having done a good job, not a bonus, but this is your actual earnings. We've structured it so that legally we can pay you less because we know the customer is going to pay you. And since then, it has not been that. And that is certainly before our lifetime.
When we spoke to you a couple of years ago about tip creep, you said, and I mean, you just kind of said it now, that it's something that's really hard to go back from. Since that period of time, 2021, 22, has tip creep accelerated? Has there been a pushback against it? I'm trying to get a sense of, as the pandemic has eased, if people, and as we've had a financial crunch, if people are voting with their wallets against this kind of overreach by businesses.
I don't know that people vote with their wallets, although, we'll begin to see that. Interest rates are finally coming back down, but not enough to really ease people's pockets. Ultimately, people are in a crunch. What we see through anecdotal evidence and through polls is people have had enough of tipping. They're frustrated. Every poll suggests that people resent tips and that they're exhausted from tipping. They're exhausted from the confusion that comes with knowing how much to tip in different situations. And, there was a recent poll from Probe Research that asked people specifically if they felt confident that they knew where their tips were going when they tipped. And 32% of the respondents in that poll said yes, which I found not surprising, but alarming, because in my 15 years of writing about restaurants, a lot of that focusing on tips and tipping, I've never met a single person who didn't work in the industry who could accurately describe how tips are divided. So there's both the confusion of where this money goes and a resentment whenever people find out where it does go. Having said that, what is the public going to do about it? It's not exactly a referendum level issue. And I don't see enough fervor to make it a, election issue. I don't see anybody campaigning on it, although it is happening a little bit in the States right now with Trump and Harris. But I don't think the industry is going to change on its own. And as to your question of will we vote with our dollars, we're already doing that as the increasing cost of everything makes dining less affordable. And the result is ultimately we eat out less.
If we're talking about this as a political issue, before we get to what Harris and Trump are proposing, I'd ask you about something close to home. Quebec is passing new legislation that is not just about this, to your point of this not being an overwhelming election issue, but contains some stuff about tips that I guess is trying to make it less confusing. Can you explain what they're doing?
Yeah, Quebec is doing something very interesting. They're proposing legislation that would require businesses to calculate tip based on the pre-tax total, not the post-tax total. And what's fascinating about that is, at the very least, it opens up this discussion about, wait, how are you adding up my tip? Because the majority of the time, it is added up after tax, meaning we're paying an additional 20% to whom we don't really know who, but we're paying a tip based on the government's revenue. That, no matter how you justify tips, if you do, there's no justification of why we would tip on tax.
As cash has been phased out almost everywhere in replacement of debit and credit card payment, has tipping become more confusing or difficult to navigate? I mean, theoretically, it should be easier, right? Like, you've got the machines at least showing you what the percentage is.
Yeah, I think it's been a little bit easier for businesses to a certain extent, in the sense that those digital prompts, I think, are a game changer. I'd be curious if there's any research on how that changed tipping percentages. But, those prompts telling us, used to be like 10, 15, 20, 15, 20, 25. Now we'll see like 18, 25, 30. That at the very least makes it a bit more navigable, in that we don't have to guess wildly, but we may also just be looking at that going, wait, I don't know, what am I supposed to tip? Most of us don't know where it's going. We don't know that we're tipping on tax. We probably don't know. I actually had to confirm this morning before our interview. I reached out to a couple restaurateurs to ask them, do you set that post-tax fee, or does the financial institution who leases your payment terminal, do they do that? And the answer was like, it's the banks. They come programmed like that. The restaurant is not the one to blame there.
So do we even know if they could change that if they wanted to?
I don't think it's a question of the businesses being forced to change it. It's the banks who control the technology being forced to do that. And I think that is who Quebec's legislation will directly affect. Those are the people who have to make the change.
Hey, you! Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump
Why
Rules,
does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me, because you've not seen me activated.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend. I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.
Does that legislation go far enough? What else could we do theoretically to, restore? I know I'll put quote marks around that word because of you've said it hasn't been this way for decades, but restore tipping to its true intent.
I don't know if there's any going there, but I think what Quebec is proposing is welcome legislation that consumers, the ones who have asked those questions and gone, hey, why am I tipping on the government's tax? I think those people have been asking for a long time, and everyone deserves that. Like, come on, let's not skim here. I don't know how much of a difference it'll make to consumers or workers if you're calculating the tip based on the post-tax total. That's like another typically 20% on that 15% in Quebec, which is another 3% to the customer's total, if my math is right. If tips are the majority of your earnings, that's significant. But by any measure of how tips are justified, taking that cup, there's no justification. I do think this matters. And I think that what they could do further, it's within their power, is to legislate the transparency of where the tips are divided. Like I said, nobody knows where tips go. To force restaurants to put on the menu, hey, 100% goes to front of house staff, or we split it 60-40 front of house, back of house, or total gross sales for each server, 3% goes to, just put it on the menu. I'd love to see that.
So far, we've been talking about traditional businesses that use tips to supplement their workers. The other side of tip creep, of course, is where we're now asked to tip. And have you seen that abate at all since the early days of the pandemic, or is it still creeping elsewhere?
It's still creeping, Jordan. I recently got a tip prompt at a boutique grocer, which has like a coffee counter in there. And I'm sure that's their justification for, well, we use the same cashier for the cafe. So of course, but I mean, I went in and bought some bread, and I got a tip prompt. It's become totally standard at bakeries. I recently got a tip prompt at my tailor. I waited to have some pants shortened.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Great tailor only charges me $7 for a pants shortening. I was, 20% was very minimal on top of that. And yet at the same time, my head spun. And I think in the fast casual QSR sector, which is, McDonald's, Shake Shack, encompassing all that. In fast food, I'm not seeing it, but in fast casual, I've seen it become almost standard that there's a tip prompt at places where we're served via a counter, which, for most people doesn't meet their classical definition of a tipping situation, regardless of how I feel about it. But, once it is enshrined there, it becomes standard everywhere. And it makes it additionally pretty much nearly impossible for any restaurateur who wants to eliminate tipping or start without tipping to present this, given how it's just become such a default in so many places.
Is that perhaps where a government like Quebec's might get involved in terms of just legislating, like, who is allowed to ask for tips? Because it's one thing for, even if we're just talking about grocers, right? It's one thing for your organic neighborhood grocer to maybe ask for a tip. Nobody's gonna tip Loblaws. Like, where is a fair place, I guess, to draw the line? And if not with legislation, then just, for everybody's own self in terms of when they're actually willing to hit the zero tip button.
Well, certainly nobody wants to tip Loblaws, but I don't want to put words in Galen Weston or Per Bank's mouth. But if they could get an additional 20% from consumers, they would love to. I think what Quebec is doing is a foot in the door and having some say in legislation about tips. It's not the only part of that. Most provinces legislate how tips can be divided, not how they are divided, but they have legislation about basically with the intention of preventing owners from taking a cut of tips. But as a result, it makes it difficult in some places for the kitchen, the back of house, to be included in the tip pool. Notably, Manitoba, where I live, doesn't have any legislation about how tips are divided. So it makes it, it opens the door to all kinds of chicanery from owners. But I think what Quebec's doing is like an interesting start. At the very least, it engages the public in that conversation about going, hey, maybe there is something shady about this, and maybe I don't know where this money is going. I think just the eye-opener part of it is valuable. I think what's happening in the States connects to what you raise about Loblaws in the sense that you've got presidential candidates saying, I won't tax your tips.
Right. Maybe just stop there and expand that for people who haven't been following the U.S. election, or at least the tipping part of it. The rest of it's inescapable. Just explain what each candidate's promising to do if you can.
Sure. So it's a rare case of Democrats borrowing from Republicans. But during the summer, Trump promised, hey, if elected, I won't tax your tips. It was a popular enough idea that Harris copied him. Trump didn't really have a lot of detail. Harris says there will be a cap on how much tipped income is untaxed, and includes some language about preventing like hedge fund managers and lawyers from structuring their compensation to take advantage of this. But both of them incentivize the increased use of tips in place of wages as compensation. That's what's troubling, because it sounds nice, even though, the reality is like a huge number of tipped employees in the States like don't pay taxes because they don't even earn enough. Another large percentage, and it's the same case in Canada, routinely declare far less on their income tax than they're owed. But the larger issue is if you incentivize employers to say, hey, this is better for everybody if they're tipped instead of being paid a wage, that just increases tip creep. That gives more incentive to people to structure all new categories of job to have their compensation based on tipping instead of wages. That's not a good thing.
Where do you draw your own line? When do you hit no tip? Do you have a personal policy? Do you base it on encounter by encounter? What do you do?
I do have a personal policy. The only time I've ever left zero tip, I was meeting with a friend, a chef, to talk business. We met at a cafe, and they gave us our order in a styrofoam cup. And we said, no, we're sitting down here. And the person there said, yeah, but we're closing in a half hour. I don't want to wash this cup. And my friend said, no matter what, do you have exact change? We cannot leave even 1 cent for this person. This is egregious. That was the only time I've ever left zero tip. Since becoming, I was a restaurant critic for a couple of years. And after that, people kind of knew me around the town enough that I just felt like, doesn't matter how horrible the service is, I'm always going to leave 20%, just because I won't be able to tell people the story of bad service. They'll only hear that I left a bad tip. So no matter what, I'm always leaving 20%. That's my default.
Even at the organic grocers on the loaf of bread?
At that time, when they asked me, I left at 20%. I just didn't want them saying, to their coworker, came in Corey Mintz, and he stiffed me. Oh yeah, I heard he was a cheapskate. But what I'd recommend for most people, which I've done plenty of times myself, is I leave the tip, I leave the 20%. If I care, ask about it. Canadians don't like to talk about money the way that Americans do, but I think we can, and I think the conversation about tipping can be more fluid. If you don't like a policy or don't understand a policy and have questions, ask. But the challenge is, the person to ask is the owner. It's not the employee serving you, and it's not the manager who doesn't really create the policy. They enforce it, not to haul out that line. It's the owner. So if you really care or object, the challenge is take the time, find that person's contact information. That doesn't mean go leave a nasty Yelp review. That's not a conversation. I mean, ask for the name of the owner, get their email them, ask them about it, carry that conversation further. Let them be the person who directly hears about it, not the person working the tip.
Corey, thank you for this. And I also just have a feeling that we could do a whole other episode sometime on the influence of Yelp reviews in terms of replacing restaurant critiques.
Another third-rail topic. Anytime, Jordan.
Corey Mintz is a consultant, a food reporter, and the author of The Next Supper. That was the big story. If you would like, please do send us your examples of the most egregious places you've been asked to leave a tip. We'll read a bunch of them out next time we do a feedback episode. You can send them to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or call us up and leave a voicemail 416-935-5935. I will mention again, because we've gotten some good voicemails lately, that if you're leaving a voicemail that you would like us to play on those feedback episodes, just let us know, because we won't use your voice unless you say we can, because we're nice like that. The Big Story is available in every single podcast player, and it's on your smart speaker. Just ask it to play The Big Story Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.
Hey you, Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activated.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend, I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.